Hi, I'm Scott McLean from transmusicmastery.com. In this video, I will show you how Adam Sabo created a lead sound like the one heard in Symphonica original mix by Daniel Kandi presents Timmus. And the sound that Adam created sounds like this. Okay, and let me bring up the MIDI clip real quick. Let's take a look. Now, if we look at the lower note, it appears that this note is based on C, then it goes up to D, then down to G, and then down to F. And then above it we have G and D sharp, then there's a D, C in here, A sharp. It's basically like an arpeggio type sequence. We've got C, G, D sharp, C, D sharp, C, G, C, G, D sharp, and so on until it switches here to C, G, D, C, D, C, G, and it looks like it's 8th notes, well, 16th notes, and occasionally there's a rest in between. It looks like the pattern is 3 notes with a 1/16th rest followed by 4 notes, then 3 notes, 1/16th rest, 4 notes, 3 notes, 1/16th rest, and 4 notes. And then it repeats here, 3 notes, 4 notes, 3 notes, 4 notes, 3 notes. So it looks like that pattern, that rhythmic pattern repeats. So let me go ahead and play through the sequence with the MIDI clip being displayed. Okay, and let me go ahead and pull up the sound map for that patch. And Adam Sabo says, this patch uses different techniques to achieve the tone and character of its sound. Some pulse waveforms are pulse width modulated, then distorted slightly to give it some more edge. So there are 2 oscillators, both using pulse waves. And oscillator 1 is using a single pulse wave, oscillator 2 is using a quad pulse wave. Those are being modulated by LFO 1 and 2. LFO 1 is modulating the pulse width of each oscillator, and LFO 2 is modulating the pitch of each oscillator. The output of each oscillator is flowing into the filter. This is configured as an LP old drive. Then that flows into a shaper. The shaper adds distortion, and then the output of the shaper flows into a filter, again an LP old drive. And then that flows into an amplifier with the volume being modulated by envelope 1 with 0 attack, medium decay, sustain at 49.5%, and a fast release. And then that flows into the effects and then into the main output. So for the effects, we have an EQ with a bandpass filter applying a plus 7 dB boost near 500 Hz, a bandpass filter applying a plus 6 dB boost near 2.25 kHz, and a high shelf with a plus 4.5 dB boost near 7 kHz. Then that flows into a delay. This is a stereo delay with the left 1/8 and the right at 1/4, and a 28% dry wet mix. And then that flows into a reverb with approximately a 5 to 6 second reverb tail, so this is a relatively long reverb tail. Some dampening for less bright reverb, and a 34% wet mix. And then that flows into the main output. Okay, let's build this patch. Okay, I'm starting from the initialize patch. Let me go ahead and play part of the sequence. Okay, first thing we're going to do is set the global tune to 0. And now we want to configure the oscillator. So we're going to invert and use some pulse width modulation for this patch. So I'm going to increase the phase amount to 40.5. And next I'm going to set the phase restart on note start, enable that, and then bring the volume level up to 200. And for this patch, we're going to modulate the pulse width using LFO1 and set the amount to 33. And we'll make some adjustments to the LFO settings next. So for this, we want to set the sync time to 1/2 and bring the amp down to 18. Okay, the next thing that we want to do with oscillator 1 is modulate the pitch or the tune with LFO2. And we're going to set the amount to 5. And obviously that's way too much, so let's make some adjustments to LFO2. First thing I want to do is set the sync time to 1/16, the wave shape to triangle, and then bring the amp down to 5. And just to demonstrate the difference between the triangle shape and the sine shape. And then I'll try 1/4 versus 1/16. So you saw how I selected 1/32 note sync time, and that's too much. So I brought it back to 1/16, which is what Adam had programmed. So next, we want to add oscillator 2. Oscillator 2 is going to use quad voices. So let's go ahead and detune those by setting detune to 7. And we're going to modulate the tune or pitch of oscillator 2 as well using LFO2 and set the amount to 5. And we want to set the invert switch on oscillator 2 to yes, and the phase set that to 52.5. Okay, and then we're going to modulate the pulse width with LFO1 and set the amount to 29.5. And then finally bring the volume level down a bit for oscillator 2 to 82. Okay, and I just want to check the oscillator section here. And one thing to note for oscillator 1 and 2 is, depending on the initialize patch that you're using, you may need to bring up the normalize property to match the patch that was programmed by Adam Sabo. So for this one, I need to bring, because I'm using the default initialize patch, this has normalize at 0. For this particular patch, we need to bring normalize up, setting it to 10. What that does is it raises the level of the waveform. So let me increase normalize to 10 for oscillator 1. And And then I'm going to do the same thing for oscillator 2, setting normalize to 10. Okay, next, going to configure the envelope. And for this one, we're going to use a rather fast decay, setting it to 23.5 and bringing the sustain level down to 49.5 and the release increasing that to 23 and then bringing the velocity down to 0. So I'm going to start with the velocity. Okay, so it has a more plucky character to it. Next, we want to add a filter. Let's add VCF1. We're going to set the type to LP old drive. And for this one, we're going to leave the cutoff at 150, add envelope modulation on ENV2. This will modulate the cutoff, filter cutoff, and set it to 28. So to get a sense of how this is affecting the sound, I'm going to lower the cutoff just for the next moment here while I configure the envelope settings. So I set the ENV2 amount to 28, and right now the cutoff is set at 73. I'm going to increase the key follow to 71.5. And then set the drive to 100. And then finally set the envelope 2 settings. Set the decay to 32, the sustain level to 0, the release to 7, and the velocity to 0. Okay, next I'm going to return the filter cutoff to 150. And actually what I'll do is I'll bring it all the way down to 0 and I'll sweep up just so you can get a sense of how this envelope modulation with the key follow drive and these envelope settings are affecting this filter response. Okay, and just to demonstrate the effect that the filter has on the sound, I'm going to disable it and then re-enable it. Okay, next we want to add some distortion, so add a shaper 1. And we're going to switch the type to wedge, bring the depth up to 100, the edge to 100, the input, bring that to 2, and the high out, set that to 11.2. The reason we bring the input up a little is because it actually affects how the distortion unit responds. So we can drive this thing to greater degrees of distortion by increasing that input level. Okay, next we want to add a filter, another filter, VCF2. Set the filter type to LP old drive. Set the resonance to 14.5. Set the drive to 34.5. And we're going to modulate this filter cutoff with ENV2. I'm going to lower the cutoff frequency a bit while I adjust the modulation. So I'll set the cutoff, let's just set it to 8 to 78, and then I'm going to bring the envelope 2 amount up to 40. And then now I'll bring the cutoff down and then sweep it all the way up. So with and without filter 2. Okay, so next I'm going to add EQ. And for this we want to put a 7 dB boost with filter number 2, just below 550 Hertz. And set the resonance to 3.0, that will broaden the bandwidth. Filter 3, we're going to use that to put a 6 dB boost in between 1.75 and 3 kilohertz. And bring the resonance down to 5, which will increase the bandwidth. And then finally with filter number 4, put that just above 5.5 kilohertz and apply a 4.5 dB boost. Okay, next we're going to add delay. And for the delay, we want to set sync 1 time to 1/8. Lower the crossback to 0. I'm going to lower feedback to 0 for a moment. I'm going to bring up the mix to 28. And next, increase the feedback to 12.5. And next, add a reverb. Set the dry amount to 100. The wet amount, I'll mix it in, setting the wet to 34. Pre-delay, we're going to set that to 28. That will allow the initial hit of the note to sound before we hear the reverb. And range, we're going to set that to 68, set the feedback to 73, increase the dampening to 6.9, the speed, we'll set that to 56, and the modulation to 46. So I'll go through and make those changes next. And when I was adjusting the damp, I had to hold the shift key down to fine tune it to hit that to set it to 6.9 exactly. Okay, for the diffusion, we're going to leave D range at 50, set D feedback to 50, D mix to 80, which will open up the reverb a little bit, D speed to 100, and then demodulation, we're going to leave that at 50. So let me go ahead and make those changes. Okay, last thing we need to do is just make some level adjustments here. I'm going to increase the output to 86 and the master, bring that down to 50. And that completes the patch. I'll see you in the next video.